So with that, I might just move on to introducing the main reason we're here, which is really to talk about the Enhanced Crash Investigation Study itself. And I am going to introduce Michael, but you could start to come up while I just read a little bit about you, Michael. So Associate Professor Michael Fitzharris is a behavioural scientist and currently heads the Regulation and In-Depth Crash Investigation team at the Monash University Accident Research Centre, where he is also an Associate Director. His PhD is in the area of post-crash recovery, in particular the links between personality, coping styles and pain, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Michael has conducted road safety research and policy work for over 2 decades in the area of road user performance, vehicle safety regulation, driver monitoring in heavy vehicle fleets, drug driving and drink driving, and also the link between mental health and road safety. Michael has an extensive international road safety career, having lived in Johannesburg for 3 years as Director MUARC, South Africa, and having worked in India and China through his time at the George Institute for Global Health. On his return to Australia, Michael led the ISCAR evaluation of the 5-year TAC 2015 claims model and initiated this enhanced crash investigation study. As Chief Investigator of the ECIS program from the beginning, he led the design, implementation and conducted the ECIS program. And of course, Michael is presenting the key findings here today. So welcome, Michael, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I think we've done a lot of work over a long period of time, and it was a significant investment on the part of the TAC, so we're really grateful to Janet Dorr. Jo was head, I think, of community support, or whatever it was called at the time, and really made a significant contribution at the board. So I'd really like to thank the TAC board. Drink that actually. It's been a long journey. And in the interests of paramedic health, I'm going to take you on a journey on an amazing data set that I am here to represent the people who worked hard in collecting it at MUARC, and there's a list of them, an extensive list of people. I think we topped 35 people at one point. Of staff members, so it was a really significant challenge. But I'm only here as a figurehead. This work could not have been done without their outstanding work and dedication from the hospital at the Alfred and the Melbourne all the way through, and you'll get a feel for that as well. I will say that at the end of the session there'll be a QR code. All reports will be released along with 5 fact sheets. Sam will have the QR code. It wasn't a hard decision to say we won't release that now because we want people looking at it, but all the information's there. I'll make the PowerPoint slides available as well. But I do stand here on behalf of people, and I'm very grateful to the TAC for their ongoing support, and there are a heap of people here to do that. And I think Sam's pointed out why we did this study and the impact of trauma on people and its negative impact on their life as moving forward. So it's really, these findings in part are extraordinarily challenging. They're difficult to digest at some part. We're speaking to the data and there's, something that we will take you through. The journey is going to be much more rapid, and we all might need some resuscitation at 2:45, where we'll have a Red Bull pit stop perhaps of 2.4 seconds. But I'll get sort of moving along. Now, these are just some of the people who've supported the study, at least organisationally, and we're obviously very grateful for those and our international colleagues who've supported us all throughout the whole program as well, and obviously starting the TAC and moving through the hospital as well. I'm going to give a really rapid introduction to the method and what the reports kind of look like. We don't have a lot of time, so please bear with me. There's a lot of material, probably too many slides, of course. Michael always does that. But I think one of the things, if I'm skipping slides, we can ask about it, but all the slides will be available, and I'll just try and pick out in the time the salient points as we move through to get the key points across. One of the key things is this study really relies on the people who participated at the worst time of their life. my nurses, and I did my PhD at the Alfred, one of the hardest things to do is to approach a person who is going through the worst time of their life, or their next of kin if they have a serious brain injury or they're in intensive care, and ask them to participate in a research study. They did so willingly, and we had a 67% consent rate from those we approached who were eligible for the study, which is extraordinary. We protect their information fiercely because that's really important to us, because they're incredibly honest about what they did, and it allowed us to get a really important perspective. So it's really important that we use these findings well to support them and to support road safety moving forward, to honour their contribution. There's a lot of people involved. We can't read them out. Some of them are here, Tandy and others are here, and I'm really grateful. People at the TAC and so on, the full list is there. It just gives you a scope and range as to the magnitude of the study, and sometimes Michael's management challenge that he faced, and I thank the directors of MUARC for having patience to tolerate me. I will make the point that there are some images of cars here. Please don't photograph or post to Twitter or social media those vehicles. We've got consent to use things for educational purposes, but they're not to be put on Twitter, and I will be fiercely having something to say about that. We have ethics committee approval that guides the privacy of the study and the conduct of the study to make sure it was done in an ethical way. These are the sort of things that are important for us to point out, at least at the start. Now, overview of ECIS in the, not long. So, 8 years, how do you sum up 8 years? I'll do my best. All right, so we're going to release 4 reports. One's already released in November 2020, and the other 3 will be released today. We were tasked with looking at the factors associated with crash occurrence and injury occurrence and injury severity. And the 4th report is looking at, well, what do you do about it? And we left no stone unturned. We worked with a blue sky approach. We used case level information. Report 4 really is about identifying the countermeasures and the opportunities from across the entire system and the crash chain, which we also developed, and I'll take you through. We had 2 arms. People admitted to the hospital, and we had 400, and we conducted the study quite some time ago. And we also had a control arm, and the control arm was really important because these were people who drove through exactly the same site a week or 2 or 3 later of where the crash had occurred. Their speed was monitored with a laser speed camera. We sent them a survey thanks to the hard work of people at the TAC. They responded. It gives us an enormous amount, but what it does do is it gives us the information on people who passed exactly through the same place where a crash occurred, but who didn't crash. So we could compare the difference between the people, and we were particularly interested in speed. This is a case control study, the Cloden study, and Sam's here, I think, from CASA, I think I saw. So really grateful, Sam, for coming along. But that very famous Cloden study tells us all about speed and crash risk. One of our goals was to replicate that in Victoria on a modern car fleet in our situation. So just quickly, our research nurses, I'll just take you through the pictures. We enrolled people at the Alfred and the Melbourne over that period, and then people, Tandy and the others in the crash investigation team inspected the vehicle, inspected the site. We collected every piece of information we possibly could, even from the medical form, everything. So you can imagine the volume of information. The database has about 3,780 variables when I last looked. Epic, and we have everything from pre-hospital all the way through. Crash reconstructions were done, the site was inspected and so on, and what it really did was it gave us an opportunity to look at every single element of the crash and every single behaviour, starting with the perspective of the drivers involved, and we had all sorts of information, and all of that is listed in the report. People are 18 to 93, half are male. It's a very seriously injured sample. Sam indicated MAS 3+, 47% of our sample is of that ilk, and that's important for us to be able to understand and compare the differences between the 2 groups as well. This just gives an indication again of some numbers. It involved a lot of people, and we had 18 deaths in 17 crashes as well. So this is a really severe end study. We have people from across Victoria, thanks to the Alfred and the Melbourne having helicopters, and that's a really important part of trauma care, and I've got some comments to make on the importance of time to definitive care and the treatment and management of the injured driver and occupants as well. Financial cost of these people is epic, but they also have a very long and considerable recovery time, and I've seen that firsthand, and I've seen what weight-bearing injuries do to tradies and paramedics and essential services workers. It changes people's lives forever. The canary in the coal mine is always marital problems. We see that, and that's really important to understand. In terms of the control arm, I've already mentioned it, but we had a laser speed gun. We measured people's speed, and that was really important because we also did a lot of work on crash reconstruction. The team, great team, reconstructed a heap of crashes in full 3D. All the roads were recreated, friction coefficients, everything, put them together, and even ran hypothetical scenarios. So we were able to draw out a lot of information as long as collecting black box event data recorder information, and we've got some key points on the need to make that more available for a whole host of reasons as well. Injury severity metrics we've already mentioned. That's a pretty nasty femur injury. You can see that's probably a classic pattern where someone's put their foot on the brake or on the floor pan and the front crush of the vehicle does the rest with the level of energy, and that's high to cause that kind of injury. These are the sort of injuries that we see. MAS 3+ is not just a threat to life scale, but as you go up from 4, 5, 6, your probability of survival decreases. 6 is not actually dead, but your survival rate's quite low. So think of something like an aortic tear. You don't have long, but it is treatable. So we have that definition of a 3+. A lot of the spinal cord injuries sit in the 4, 5, 6 range that are absolutely life-changing, and sadly we have some of those. Injury severity was high, and we can see that. This gives an example of our 3+. We've got 47%. The other subtlety in all of how you measure injury severity is really important because you can have multiple MAS 2 injuries. So you can have a 2 to the head, which is a loss of consciousness for up to 60 minutes. You can have some ribs, and you can have a tib or a fib, but you're not a 3. So you have multi-body trauma injury that takes also a very long time to recover. It's a subtlety in how we measure things, but we can't also dismiss people with MAS 2 injuries because they can happen from literally top to toe and you're still not a 3+. What we did see, and there are reasons for this, is that we see as you move from metropolitan Melbourne out into the rural regions, the percentage of drivers who have a 3+ is up and up and up, and it's quite clear from this particular chart. This points to the crash type and the crash severity and the impact speeds, and we've unpacked all of that, and I'll go through as best I can how we manage that. With the information we have, one of the things that we did is you can't treat crashes as just this single. We based our crash type definitions, of which there are subtypes, based on vehicle movement, because that's actually how you would choose appropriate countermeasures and actually study the site and actually study decisions the driver may make, intentionally, unintentionally, or performance errors or for reasons of impairment. People get themselves into all sorts of a pickle. But the reason these vehicle movements are important is because they're actually important in defining how you actually manage that part of the trauma. It's all in the report, it's in great detail. A lot of the lane departure crashes formed a pretty large part of our sample, and a lot of them were quite severely injured as well, as we can see from this. So we can see our 3+ and our injury severity does actually change as we move from lane departure to a cross path / intersections and to rear impact. And that rear impact is the person doing the hitting and the person who is struck. So it includes frontal and so that frontal hit as well as being hit from behind, and we disaggregate that. These metrics tell us people are in hospital for an average period of up to 10 days, and I will tell you that a substantial proportion go to rehab as well, and you can see that there, and something's happened with my colours, but we can see that just about half of the people in lane departures also crashes go to rehab. So it just points to the magnitude of these type of crashes and the need to urgently do something about them. And this is what some of them look like. These are some of our crashes, and I think one of the key points to take away from this is people make performance errors or judgment errors or all sorts of things. The road design is crucial to that, and our data shows that if the conditions are not quite right, the propensity for a driver to make an error is actually double based on the presence of certain conditions, and that's why safety by design is really important, so that across carriageway we have a whole series of recommendations or countermeasures, I should say, about the management of that, and there are many from the driver to the vehicle to the road, and how to manage these kind of high severity hits. And we can see in ECIS does tell us a couple of things. It tells us that the impact speed is such that even the best currently available vehicles cannot protect people from serious injury. That's a really important point, and that's what this study shows. Even 5-star cars cannot sustain and protect the occupants from serious injuries when crashes occur. It's quite extraordinary to think about, because that's the settings and that's the type of impact configurations that we're exposing people to risk to. Just some more, and you can see again the influence of the environment and the speed, and these are just, I was having a lot of trouble in my mind, and Mike Lene, who's a co-author, just said, put a couple of pictures up and just talk about. And it's like, well, I could do a TED talk, but I'm a bit stressed. So, I think when you look at these, you can pretty clearly unpack it. I know this young bloke here in that top left. Sorry, I'm left-handed. Everything's in reverse, and it's doubly so. Set the cruise control. Thought no one was coming through. Morning run, rural, straight through an intersection. Unexpected car. Died at the scene. Cruise control was on the other vehicle as well, mum taking child to school. Disastrous consequence. And you can see simple decisions, but it's also roadway design and where we set the parameters of the system and what we actually allow as system designers and operators, what we permit. And the other part of this study that's really important is that even compliant drivers are not protected with the settings that we run our system at. That's what this data shows. Hi, Antonietta. Hello. Amazing contribution to ECIS, and also David Healy as well. And maybe say something about that too. To understand crashes, one of the things, and this is sort of quite theoretical and I'm really running short of time, but one of the things is we all know Vision Zero and Klaus Tingvall's influence. And one of the things about how, we often see the safe system approach of safe drivers, safe vehicles, safe road speed management. How do you operationalise that? How do you actually make it work as a system? We've gone from pillars to that to how do you operationalise it? How do you actually make it a truly systems-based analysis? And one of the things we looked at is the integrated safety chain, Max Cameron's road trauma chain, which I've got some notes on. And I think one of the things that's important is the development work that went into this is really profound. And it's sort of, we could almost do a whole presentation just on that, but we're all interested in the results as well. In the time available, I just quickly wanted to recap Vision Zero, obviously by Klaus Tingvall, its approach to road safety. The idea is that no one's seriously injured. It places distinct responsibilities on the users of the system, the designers of the system and the operators. So that means vehicle manufacturers, it means government and how we set the agenda of how we run our system. And consistent with Vision Zero, safe system approach is obviously a powerful tool and it's transformed our thinking. I'm really going fast. The principles of Vision Zero you can read there. The loss of life, it's just an unacceptable trade-off for that unfettered mobility. So Klaus layered in this real ethical responsibility to how we design, run and operate the road transport system. And it sort of says, if you've got the settings right and a person behaves and performs as they should, if a driver does commit error, they shouldn't be seriously injured. That's the whole point. So you need to then have the settings right. So what are those settings and how does our system not quite stack up to those settings? And then what on earth do we do about it? That's the point of the story that we're into today. Some of these concepts otherwise stem back to the work of Bill Haddon on basically the tolerance of the human body to injury is finite. So often if you do this experiment at home because you're bored and you make a mistake, if you drop a can of tinned tomatoes on the ground, it won't break. If you really throw it, it will break. And it's sort of that force becomes really important. Just think about the same of people in a car. And that's the sort of overlay that Bill Haddon gave, that energy was the etiologic agent for injury. It was the thing that caused injury and it needed to be managed. Klaus put an ethical overlay, and he also set responsibilities and obligations to system designers and set the boundaries of how the driver ought to behave. And if they do, the promise is they won't be seriously injured. Klaus had this model, and I'm going to, as quickly as I can, sort of explain it because it is quite important. But basically, down the bottom is the human tolerance to injury. How hard you hit is how much and how severe you're going to be injured. That's the main limiting parameter of the system upon which everything is based. And then he sort of set design criteria. What does the vehicle need to look like? What does the driver need to do? What are their responsibilities? What are extreme behaviours that we cannot engineer out, that we can't design the system for? And that's a really important point. That goes down to, if you comply with the rules of the system, the other parts of the systems are in balance to the point where if you make an error, you will not be seriously injured. It's a fundamental point. And that's something that's really important. The speed limit is a critical regulator of the safety of the system, and I'll explain why that's the case. But it basically has to do with certain interrelationships. The safe driver criteria, these are important as to what I'm going to present today as well, but Klaus's model and the Vision Zero model, or the multi-dimensional safe system model thing, set these parameters and said a safe driver is someone who is compliant, seatbelts worn, they're driving within the speed limit, they're not impaired by alcohol or drugs, and they're not handling, we added they're not handling their mobile phone, and they're also not excessively tired. The reason for that is because we want people to be able to respond appropriately when a threat emerges. We want them to drive safely. Notice that speed limit's not in there, but I'll come to that and come to why. Klaus also assumes in this model that if the driver's doing the right thing and they're in a 5-star car with these other requirements and the speed limit is set in accordance with the surrounding road infrastructure, they won't be seriously injured when they commit an error. And they do commit errors. So one of the really important points is these safe driver criteria underpin the system, and they relate directly to the ability to perform what we call normal driving, safe driving, routine driving, when you're just cruising along and nothing much is happening. Because the point is, when something does happen, either yourself or someone pulls out, you need to respond. That's the model. So how well does our system stack up? This is an ECIS report 1. Green is good, red is obviously bad. We can see that the driver, even though they're the best performing element of the system in terms of meeting those compliance criteria, it's still less than 50%. It's extraordinary, really. And then we see just how poor our vehicle fleet is, and then we have a look at the roads, and we can see that there's an enormous mismatch between what theoretically the speed limit should be matched to the surrounding safe road infrastructure. That's really important. Now, a key premise is when you put that together, for the people in the green in all three, should they be seriously injured? Well, we only have in Victoria 2% of our data had people who met the safe driver in a safe car and on a safe road that met those criteria. Tingvale's model says something very important. If you meet all of those criteria, you will not be seriously injured. Not one of our small proportion of people had an MS3+ injury, emphasising the point, how the system works together and why it's important that all system elements are designed and set and function properly. What the data also shows is that there's 35% of crashes, and it's higher for lane departure, where no of the complete system performance criteria are met. So, and they are much more seriously injured. So the model works, and this is something that's really important. So we ask the question, speed as a regulator. Speed's a very important part of ECIS for the reasons about crash risk, exceeding the speed limit and the propensity to get into a crash, but also its relationship to impact speed's relationship to injury severity. And one of the things that's really important is there's a whole set of criteria on what speed should look like, and how you balance out the remaining infrastructure as well. But injury severity is driven almost exclusively by that impact speed, which is obviously related to the crashworthiness and the car. Now, all vehicles have limits, and it's probably one of the most significant findings is that we have demonstrated in this study that a very high proportion of crashes occur at impact speeds well beyond the tolerable safety envelope of the car, the engineered-in safety of the car. That's super important. So why is Klaus's notion and others that the speed limit is a regulator of the system, when it's impact speed that is actually the injury-causing agent? Well, our data clearly shows, and we have a couple of thousand measures of travel speed, but the travel speed that a driver chooses to go is extremely highly correlated with the speed limit, unsurprisingly. There are non-compliers, but you can actually see it, and there's graphs in report 2. We then say, well, travel speed then drives impact speed, and then injury severity is directly related to impact speed. So you can see that flow. You can see the very clear relationships as well. And the ECIS data, importantly, supports all three assertions. And that's really important because it actually gives life to why the speed limit is actually the ultimate regulator of the safety of the system and how it interacts with the safety performance of the vehicle and the safety offered by the road. ECIS data shows a couple of things, and I know that there'll be people who are really interested in this. What we also did is we had a look at speed limit compliance and the risk of being in a crash. Well, we know that only a little bit over matters, and we know that as you exceed the speed limit by 5k, 10k, 15k, we've got an increased crash risk, and that sort of replicates the work from CASA in Adelaide that was done. We can also see, and what's in the report, is that 67% of crashes occurred at impact speeds beyond that inbuilt engineered-in safety of the car, which is quite extraordinary. 2/3 of impacts are happening beyond the ability of the car to protect them. And even of 5-star cars, 41% of those impact crashes occurred in impact speeds. So our system isn't in balance. That's the key point. And as long as it remains in balance, people will be seriously injured. That's just the reality. Breaking the speed limit just makes it worse, makes a bad situation even worse. We can see that if compliance was 100%, we would automatically get what's estimated on this to be a 7.9% reduction in serious injury hospitalisation crashes. And in that model, I've taken out alcohol and drugs, and it's adjusted for age and sex and other things. It's quite complicated. You can read all about it. And we can also see we modelled the benefits of lower speed limit using probabilities, of impact speed. So for example, even if the impact speed is 10k less, and remember the upstream relationships, we can point to a 12% reduction in MAS 3+ crashes. So when you combine the two, you actually can get complete crash avoidance, and you really drop the energy of the crash when they do occur, such that the person is much less seriously injured. So in report 2, we've got a whole heap of alternative scenarios where we actually demonstrate that, and that's what the report looks like. And there's a graphical abstract, which I did my best to design. Haddon matrix, I'm not going to go too much into it, but basically it underpinned our analysis of all of the data that we collected. Haddon introduced a pre-crash, crash, post-crash, and this still remains important across the driver, the vehicle and the road. And the whole idea was to have a look at interventions and box them up. That boxing up sort of became a problem in the end because we know that with advances in vehicle technology, it actually became blurred about how the driver, the vehicle and the road actually interacted. So there were crash safety chains that moved. But the reason I put the Haddon thing there is because the principles are really robust, but it's also important because initially we designed our data collection forms sort of with this philosophy in mind and also the Vision Zero philosophy in mind. But as I say, we needed to adopt a time-sensitive thing because a lot of the vehicle safety technologies are now time-based. So if you think of you're a bit distracted, so you get a warning. You steer from your lane lane departure warning will go off. As you progress down the chain, lane keep assist, and then if you keep going, AEB kicks in and hopefully prevents the crash. That's the crash sequence in the pre-crash. That's how we looked at it. We also had a look at a couple of other models. And I pay homage here to Max, who developed the road trauma chain, as it was called, and did a lot of work in that space. And it sort of formed the basis of, dare I say, Muark's work in crash worthiness and used car safety ratings, because it put risks on that kind of continuum as well. But Max made some really important points. The energy in the pre-crash was stated to carry over. Really crucial point. It carries over from pre-crash of the energy. So when I'm on the Monash, 5 in the morning, I'm like, there's a lot of energy on this road today, i.e. there's a lot of crazy drivers going really fast. To me, that's heavy energy, it's high energy. And I've driven in Johannesburg, and I can tell you there's some energy there. So that gets a bit sporty with the tradies going to work, and it's interesting. But that's energy. That's speed, that's how we see it, right? But that carries over to the crash, as we clearly demonstrated. Really important point. The other important point, and there's lots in that work, it's in the report, and there's more coverage with Angelo, who did a PhD with Stuart, that risks are more likely to be reduced rather than eliminated due to partial or incomplete or imperfect coverage. Nothing works 100% all of the time is the point. This is really important. And things that we think work sometimes have unexpected consequences that are a little bit awkward at times, but we manage, right? Klaus started this model of basically saying there's this concept of normal driving, which is routine, regular driving. To do it, you have to be compliant with the rules, you have to be alert, oriented, you're abiding, you're wearing your seatbelt, you're not exceeding the speed limit, you're not on drugs, you're not impaired by alcohol, you're not excessively drowsy before you even get in the car. And this is important because the interventions relate to even before you get in the car, before you even begin your trip. It's what we as individuals bring to the circus when we drive. The point about Klaus's model is we really want to prevent progression through the chain. We want to put people back into normal driving. This was done with a view of vehicle safety systems. So that example that I gave, which was basically you're distracted, and there's not a distraction thing up there, but those technologies are now like driver state monitoring and so on. You could put that there, which we have done. You then get your lane keep assist warning, and then you get your lane departure, and then you intervene in ESC, and hopefully it brings you back. And if it doesn't, you fail, you end up in a crash. The crash is inevitable. The time to collision is so small, you're at the point of no return. And this is also important because this is why some vehicle safety systems don't work. If someone steps out in front of between parked cars, the time to collision is so small, not even the best safety system can do it. So this is the sort of thing that we need to think about, how we then interact the other elements of the system. As I say, we don't want people to escalate through this chain. This is what Klaus's model was, to the point where the crash is avoidable, because crashes, despite what we think, are quite rare. So how do we run and design a system for what is epidemiologically quite rare events? We don't think they're rare because this is all we see, but they are relatively rare, particularly fatalities, and serious injuries obviously less so. So one of the things is we don't want to stress the back part of the system, but we still have to plan for it, because people break through onto the other side, like Jim Morrison said. So the thing is, what we did is we took Klaus's model, and he was here, and David Healy, and Anders Lee, and Johan Strandhoff, and all the experts, and Antonietta, and Sam, and Michael Newstig, and all the team, and we developed basically what we call an enhanced, or ECIS, safety chain, and this is kind of this is its first appearance in public, so it's very exciting. But basically, we have put into the safety chain a phase that said, and Klaus kind of indicated this, the threats to normal driving. So the stuff you bring to the car, how do we manage that? And that's stuff like impaired driver cognition, and we see that with pedal problems with some older drivers. We have those. We have everything. It's really tricky, and so it's tricky to present to you. Normal driving, these are the criteria for normal driving, and then we've got deviations, emerging and critical. And basically the risk factors and the vehicle movements change in that pre-crash phase, so does the intervention focus. You escalate towards to the point where a crash is inevitable. So you go from vehicle safety systems that are warning into intervening. But we also are operating within the context of drivers behaving in a certain way on roads designed and operated in a certain way. The design philosophy of the interventions are listed. The crash is unavoidable. We've got some examples of that, and that's in the second part. And then in the second part, we're also going to talk about the crash, and they're about injury mitigation and energy control. That's it. And then post-crash. And we can see there that there's a whole range, and I'm going to talk about those, but immediate care right through to TAC, right through to going home, and then crash data monitoring systems. So what we're trying to do is create this chain. In using all of the data that we have allocated risk factors to every single box. In another separate exercise, for every single risk factor, we identified all possible countermeasures that we could find. We even ran safe system workshops and regional expert panels in rural Victoria, where we actually presented stuff to local council engineers, to local police, paramedics. How do we fix this road? And it's amazing what you can get. We're not stuck or strictly stuck on what current design, Austroad's design rules are. Sorry, Michael. We're more, it's sort of everything, right? And some sound crazy, and we're pushing the bounds. But that's really the logic model in what we've sought to do with all of the data. And we did it as a case by case. Now, really importantly, everything is about normal driving, and so this is the pre-crash phase. Everything is about normal driving. How we drive, that we want to control the car in a manner that's responsive to the road environment, that we're alert, we're oriented, and we have the ability to respond to someone else's threat. We want that situation, but normal driving has been described as baseline, routine, uneventful, benign, and safe driving. And I will say that what's interesting about our conceptualisation is that ANCAP and Euro NCAP have moved in 2026 assessment protocols into this model of that four-stage model on how they classify countermeasures. So I think that's really important. So basically, built into this model is that drivers fail for all sorts of reasons. You deviate from that space for yourself, and then it can impact on someone else. But it happens because of performance failures like errors or doing unsafe manoeuvres. You're driving adverse to the conditions or inattention, but also health and driver state factors, and intentional or non-compliant acts that are either intended or unintentional. It doesn't matter. These are all deviations that we need to correct before the situation escalates into something that's an emerging and critical, and ultimately a situation that we can no longer control. And then you're left in the hands of the vehicle and the road infrastructure. That's the whole point of the story. And then at the end, you're left in AV's hands and the hospital system, and you want to get home. So this is how the reports look. They're quite detailed, as you can possibly imagine, lots of different data, but basically we've tried to make it as clear as possible. In report 3, what we've done is we list every single risk factor that we've observed in the data set, and then report 4 takes that, and then we overlay the effect of countermeasures and say, and we say, is that countermeasure actually relevant to that risk factor given the driver or given the field of influence or the technical capability or the operating performance of what that countermeasure is. So there's not always a one-to-one, there are subsets as well. But this is how the data is kind of done. We've established this countermeasure library. We have intervention categories, and that's all in the report. I won't detail them. We have efficacy ratings, so what we have estimated either from the literature or an agreement of the effect of the countermeasure on that particular crash. That's important. And it's also in addressing that particular risk factor. So they're not necessarily crash reduction factors per se. That may be the consequence of addressing that behaviour to pull someone back into normal driving or to prevent that particular injury. We also have a time horizon. Some of our countermeasures are available now and some are available in the future, and those future-based ones are mainly vehicle technologies. They're really important because it can enumerate, it gives the number where those are likely to be relevant. So it provides investment opportunities in R&D and regulatory impetus to invest into those new technologies that will ultimately, and as we move down the chain, one of the things that you will notice, the driver becomes less relevant. the driver becomes a passenger to what the vehicle is and what the road is. That's really important at the end of the day. As soon as you're into the crash phase, you're in the hands of your car and in your hands of the safety of the road infrastructure. It's just getting there, it's a problem. So what we've highlighted, first up, these crashes are really injurious. We show that even for compliant drivers, the way the system is designed and operated and the vehicles that they're in and the speeds they're allowed to go, they are seriously injured, and the lack of supporting road infrastructure. And what we have done is we're saying concurrent action across all three actions. We're operationalising the system, and that's what the safety chain allows us to do, each with its key different point, each with its different intervention focus. In every risk factor is represented only once, and every countermeasure is represented possibly multiple times, but they're built on. But we deal with the risk factor there, and if you still break on through, you've got other things to back it up. But you can't rely on the end state to save the day, because as Max said, nothing's 100% effective all of the time. It's really important. And one of the things we did is we looked at all countermeasures independently of one another, and we had no regard at all for cost effectiveness or policy considerations whatsoever, so that's your problem. We speak to the data, and I think that's really important because it then gives others the opportunity to build packages, invest here, there or everywhere to make those decisions that have other layers and lenses and responsibilities on top of as well. In terms of pre-crash, and I'm very, very mindful of the time, pre-crash primary prevention, and I've already spoken to some of this at the start of the chain. I've already given you the hints of what it actually does. And basically, this is sort of what I've spoken about in any case. But the point of the story is, as we move through the chain, what we need to do to the driver, in the pre-crash sense, is get more aggressive. We don't want people escalating out of deviation down into the critical situation, because what comes next is the crash is unavoidable. So we need to have a range of measures that escalate in their aggressiveness and in their intent and purpose to pull people back. We want to avoid, what are we calling it, near-miss events, and safety critical events, right? We don't want those crashes to actually happen. We want to promote and support first, then we want to intervene, and then we want to aggressively take over the car. That's the role of the vehicle safety systems, to do that. So as you see, as we move through this, the driver becomes a passenger. They become less relevant. They're really critical at the deviation and the emerging stage, but in the critical stage, they're almost on their own. These are the risk factors that we have identified from a driver perspective, and this is useful to look at, and this is all in the this is not quite a table in the report, I did this, but this is the structure and colouring of the report. And we can see here from, people who've just arrived in Australia driving on the wrong side of the road, right through to licensing unlicensed drivers, influence of alcohol and drugs, you can see. And what we considered there was not the three, THC, meth, MDMA. We've got GHB, heroin, coke. We've got all sorts. It's delightful. We also call misuse of prescription medication certain opioids, so Schedule 8 drugs, opioids, certain benzodiazepines. We see that, so the impairing effects of that in 7%, and obviously in the MAS3+. We need to manage that. This is the point. How do we manage these things? Driver health is really important, the effects of stress, mental health conditions. We've got narratives of people who've ended up with psych services in the hospital and the CL psych team because of their presentation and their driving, and they're bewildered and they're lost. It's quite scary. We also have intentional self-harm. We have notes left on cars. So people are bringing to the table everything they have. Effects of acute illness on driving. Sudden illness, heart attacks, uncontrolled diabetes, epilepsy. How do we manage that? This is the point about before even people get in the car, these are our threats to normal driving. These are really challenging things that we need to manage. And then just for the sake of it, we looked at people's prior crash involvement because we know there's an association based on other research elsewhere, and we're not saying that that's a direct risk factor for this crash. We know that based on past research, there's a general association between people's prior crash involvement, also offending characteristics. And we can see 36% of our people, a driver in the crashes, had a prior speeding offence in the last 12 months. So interesting, but we're not saying that they're necessarily the speeders either. We can unpack that later. This just gives us a feel for the flow that we need to manage. So one of the things that we did do is we identified for each of those an extensive array of low, medium and high efficacy countermeasures that are available now, or with a bit of technical work and development and policy work could be available in the future, or in the case of some psych type programs, development of online tools or interventions or whatever. So I've listed here a range of different things from education through to modifying GDL requirements, lifting the age requirements of passenger restrictions. As I say, blue sky, right? Because this is the risk factor that we're seeing. I'm not putting a policy constraint on this. Enforcement's critical. Vehicle technology, not just for alcohol, but for other things as well. Even getting a letter. Look at all those people who've had prior crashes and poor behaviour through offences. And there's an absolute key role for an enhanced case managed fitness to drive approach. The design of that can be done, but we see that as important for a targeted group of people as being a step care ongoing approach for some drivers, because we don't want to deny them access, we want to support and sustain them where we can. And if you can't, what alternative transport modes can we offer them as a society to keep them mobile and independent? Because these people already may have a disability, they already may be isolated. Removal of licence might be something that isolates them further. These are all the sorts of considerations that underpin some of this thinking. Now, alcohol and other drug crashes, I just want to draw this one out because it's important. We can see there's quite a substantial proportion where alcohol and other drugs the impairing effects was a direct contributing factor to crashes. So it wasn't just present, it made a difference. And there are various combinations, and you can see that they're much more likely to be more severe crashes as well. It's a really ugly table up here, right? And I'm going to put more ugly tables up. But the point is, it's all in the report, right? And what we've got is how to manage each of these primary risk factors, and in this case, awareness through to licensing, through to in-vehicle detection, through a range of enforcement, which becomes important. Enforcement's really important across a number of fronts for some key reasons. Vehicle technology, while it's great, takes around 29 years to penetrate the entire fleet. Some of the technologies which we show as being of value aren't even currently available, or they're just available and they're not even regulated. So by the time it gets to the fleet, you've got this gap of how you manage people, because ultimately you want to take the hands and responsibility out of the driver to warn, enforce, engage the driver to get them back to normal driving, to behave. In this case, you don't even let them in the car. And there's a range of driver state monitoring systems that it will become really important in that. Other driving related threats, well, there's road infrastructure threats. And I'll politically challenge everyone by saying there's potholes everywhere. There's one now on Toorak Road, goodness gracious. Anyway, that's a whole different story. That's enormous. Anyway, you've got to change lane. The point of the story is there's a wide range of pavement deficiencies that are really important, and we've seen as direct contributing factors, where in most cases there's a link to the roadworthiness of the vehicle or the speed that the vehicle's going in appropriate wet roads. There's an interaction effect here, and same with foreign substances on the road as well. Again, we list a whole heap of things that we can do to address these risk factors. It's all in the report. And the same here, safety by design is really critical. So some of the things like poor sight distance, we've all been in that situation where you're trying to see, or even the addition of a lane on a left turn lane off a high-speed carriageway, and there's a bus or a truck doing a left turn and you're trying to cross that way. Safety by design. You shouldn't be allowed to cross a road that's got oncoming traffic at 100. What do we think's going to happen? And you're exposing the driver to the most significant and worst impact. Head, chest, bang, you've got a door and an airbag. Even with if you hit a pole, it punches you away and you wrap. These things are just on top of you. So safety by design is really critical. They're small percentages, but they're small percentage wins. And I think that's really important because our research in this study has shown clearly that your propensity to commit an error is double that, where there are latent risk factors that are just sitting there waiting for you to come along. They don't help you to make the right decision. From road infrastructure and engineering planning, this is what we need to do. And if it means reorienting and closing an intersection, shut it down. Because that's what we need to do. But there are a range of other things as we move through the chain that are road infrastructure-based measures like vertical deflection, raised pavements, hardening of shoulders, and hardening of intersections, which I'll come to, that are also really important, that can force a change. Again, lack of road delineation. We see this in lane departure and sort of mid-block clashes where things are not visible. The stop sign's over there, the painted line's gone. And you see that a lot in rural environments, and explains again error and faulty decisions to enter intersections, or just complete blissful ignorance of your requirement to yield. We've got to force people to yield, but the vision can also be impaired. Again, safety by design, and I've listed a whole series of we've seen that there's not even a sign, there's not even an advisory sign, there's not even a painted line anymore. Maintenance becomes critical, but you can actually, some flat intersections, if you go out the back of Rapanya, out of Horsham, it's just flat. You can hardly see an intersection heading west. Again, safety by design. And we also have to manage vehicle-related threats. We also saw that there's poor tyre condition. These are small percentage of cases, but these are things, again, before you even get in the car. And there are some systems in vehicle safety systems, like tyre pressure monitoring systems, light bulb warnings and so on, that people need to attend to. So we tend to rate them a little bit low because the driver still has to respond and do something about getting their vehicle into shape. So one of the things that we did say, and this is just a graph for normal driving, is that people who met the requirements for normal driving, these are foundational principles on which the driver has to do, right? So these are Tingvall's explicit design parameters. If you don't comply with these, you're going to engage in behaviours that are so extreme or technically impossible to engineer. We can't design a car to have someone driving 120, 130k, and if they crash, they're not going to be injured. It's just not possible. So that's why these behaviours are set at this way, and the seatbelt's here because it's not only injury, but it's also compliance-related criteria that indicates other behaviours. But you can see that driving within the speed limit was least, and you can see the combinations of these as well. And that was that sort of one of those cells. That's just up there because we're already behind the 8 ball when people even start their trip, and then they start their trip, and it's, there are a proportion of people that we need to manage. We're getting into this stage now where someone's trundling along, and then they, for whatever reason, performance failure, health or driver state, intentional or unintentional brake compliance, we then need to manage them, because we need them back in a state of normal driving. So what ECIS has done is enumerated and placed and enumerated all of the risk factors, so we can say this is the incidence of that behaviour or that vehicle movement, because the behaviour leads to it, or the choice or that performance failure leads to the vehicle going in a certain path, which, depending on the crash or the configuration of lane departure or the intersection, puts the vehicle in a position of conflict that eventually becomes inevitable. So what we want to do is we promote and support, and that's even the road environment. The road environment has a critical role to promote and sustain normal driving by making it easy for the driver to do the right thing, and we can see clearly there are an enormous range of failures on that we see in our crashes. We then want to warn and intervene, and then we actually have immediate and corrective action to stop people getting into real strife. And that's the point about supporting, encouraging or forcing a return back, and they get more aggressive. So you don't want escalation through the chain, and I've said all of those other points as well. One of the things that we have done down the bottom point, and the way it's structured, is that there are commonalities between some of these deviations, but we also then have specific deviations and emerging situations. So if someone departs a lane, well, that's specific to a lane departure crash, and so is the intervention. Although for rear impact cases where we have people literally having a medical illness and driving into a parked car, they've departed the lane. So we've got systems to manage that as well. One of the key things, and this is in report 1, but this goes to why this is important, is because it's a deviation from normal driving. It's different from the injury of the link between speed limit and injury outcomes, but we can see quite clearly that the association between exceeding the speed limit and crash risk is a bit different, a bit attenuated to the Cloden study, probably because the cars are newer and we're seeing a bit of a different injury profile. Who knows? Something that we need to think about. But we did see speed non-compliance was in 27%. Of our crashes, and we can see, so what it's saying is exceeding the speed limit matters. And we also show through the data that's in report 2, the population attributable fraction, so that the amount we can attribute to exceeding the speed limit for getting a crash was 8%, 7.9. So 100% compliance with the speed limit will knock serious injury crashes due to speed down by 8%. So that's a good win. We also see clearly here, again, there's a range of other measures that we see, targeting enforcement to get compliance rates up, fleet-specific drowser driver programs, which could sit into threats before you even get in the car. But then we go through and what we've done is we've got all possible vehicle technologies, and we've enumerated and said, well, seatbelt reminder systems are relevant only, obviously, to people who are not buckled up. So we can see that that's in 6.8% of cars, and those 6.8% didn't have a seatbelt reminder. So we were really careful. Things like ISA and speed systems are really important, but cross-traffic alert will stop you from even crossing at an intersection, combined with braking systems become important. Again, road infrastructure becomes critical to address these deviations and emerging situations. You've got raised reflective pavement markers, you've got rumble strips and so on. And these are things that we've got in the report that are really important, and they're relevant to certain crash types, so our percentages also vary. And as I say, one of the clear issue is here in terms of intersection crashes. There are so many different types, but the principles are largely the same. You don't want people entering, and you don't want entering at speed, and we can talk to Daisy Pearce about that, Michael. So I think one of the clear things here is failure to obey and to yield, and also disobedience of red lights as well. And we can see combined those factors, driver error, failure to yield, was seen in 38% of crashes. So really quite substantial, and how we actually manage those as well. And we know, that's one way to shut me up, turn it off. I think one of the things in the next slide, and I'm just going to be super fast now, is that there's a whole lot of lane departure and intersection signs as well. And I think the key points are here. In relation to this was a really heavy going part of the presentation. But I think one of the things that we can show clearly is that looking at the aggregation of crashes by crash type, it really gives us an understanding that if you focus just on one thing, you're not going to have a win. You need to focus on all elements of the chain, and there's lots of opportunities to address driver, vehicle, driver and the road environment to do that, and people bring things before they get in. And the final point just in this bit is as you move down the chain, the driver becomes less important in terms of their response, and the role of the vehicle technology at this point becomes much more important. And I'll leave it there.